October 28, 1944. The Vosges Mountains of northeastern France stood shrouded in an oppressive fog that seemed to swallow sound itself. Captain David Rothman pressed his back against the rough bark of a towering pine, his medical bag clutched against his chest like a shield. Around him, the remnants of 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment, huddled in whatever cover they could find. They had been cut off from the rest of their division for 3 days now, and the situation was deteriorating by the hour. The air was thick with moisture, the kind that seeped through wool uniforms and settled into men's bones. Rothman could see his breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the mountain air. The temperature had dropped considerably since nightfall, and he knew that exposure would soon become as dangerous as German bullets. He glanced at his wristwatch, its face barely visible in the dim light filtering through the dense canopy above. 0500 hours. Dawn would break soon, and with it, another day of uncertainty. Behind him, Private Tommy Sullivan lay on a makeshift stretcher constructed from 2 rifles and a torn shelter half. The 19-year-old from Boston had taken shrapnel to his left leg during yesterday's failed breakout attempt. The wound itself wasn't immediately life-threatening, but infection was already setting in. Rothman had used the last of his sulfa powder on Sullivan and 2 other wounded men the previous evening. Now, with medical supplies nearly exhausted and no resupply possible, he faced an impossible situation. The battalion's predicament had begun 4 days earlier, when they advanced too quickly through a gap in German lines, pursuing what intelligence had identified as a retreating enemy force. It had been a trap. The Germans had allowed them to push deep into the forest before closing the corridor behind them with elements from the 2nd SS Panzer Division. Now, 675 American soldiers found themselves encircled in a pocket roughly 800 yards across, surrounded by an enemy force estimated at over 3,000 men. Major Robert Harrison, the battalion commander, crouched nearby in what passed for a command post. A foxhole had been expanded and covered with branches and a tarp, creating a space barely large enough for 3 men to huddle around a map. Harrison's face was gaunt, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep. He had aged a decade in 4 days. Every decision weighed on him with crushing force, every casualty a personal failure that he carried like stones in his pockets. Rothman watched as a runner approached the command post, keeping low and moving in short bursts between positions. The young corporal slid into the hole next to Harrison, breathing heavily, his uniform soaked through with a combination of sweat and morning dew. He delivered his message in a hushed tone, but Rothman was close enough to catch fragments. More wounded in 2nd Company. Ammunition running critically low. No contact with division headquarters since yesterday afternoon. The captain knew what this meant. The radios had been damaged during the initial encirclement, and subsequent attempts to establish communication had failed. They had tried sending runners through the German lines, but none had returned. Overhead supply drops were impossible due to the dense forest canopy and the risk of materials falling into enemy hands. They were truly cut off, fighting not just against a superior enemy force, but against time itself. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Rothman made his rounds among the wounded. There were now 43 men who could no longer fight, and that number grew with each German probe of their defensive perimeter. He moved from position to position, checking bandages, offering words of encouragement, rationing the few remaining pain medications with the careful precision of a jeweler dividing precious stones. Corporal James Mitchell sat with his back against a fallen log, his right arm bound tightly against his chest. A German machine gun burst had shattered his collarbone 2 days prior. The injury should have been treated in a field hospital with proper surgery, but here, in this green hell, Rothman had done what he could with field dressings and improvised splints. Mitchell's eyes were glazed with pain and fever, but he managed a weak smile when the captain approached. "How are we looking, Doc?" Mitchell asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rothman knelt beside him, placing a hand on the young man's forehead. Warm, but not burning. That was something at least. "We're hanging in there, Corporal. Just need to hold out a little longer." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but lies that offered hope were sometimes more valuable than harsh truths that offered none. Rothman checked the bandage, relieved to see that the bleeding had stopped. Infection was his primary concern now, and without antibiotics, there was little he could do beyond keeping wounds clean and hoping for the best. The medical situation was becoming critical. Rothman had started with 2 complete medical bags when the battalion had begun its advance. Now he had less than a quarter of his original supplies. Bandages had been washed and reused until they fell apart. Morphine syrettes were down to 3. Sulfa powder was completely exhausted. He had even resorted to using strips torn from the cleanest uniforms available to create makeshift dressings. As the morning progressed, the forest came alive with the sounds of war. German artillery began a methodical bombardment of their position, the shells screaming through the trees before detonating with earth-shaking force. The Americans had learned to identify the different sounds. The high-pitched whistle of the 88-millimeter guns that the Germans used with devastating effectiveness. The deeper, more ominous rumble of the heavier 150-millimeter howitzers that could shatter entire trees and turn the forest floor into a moonscape of craters. Men pressed themselves into their foxholes, making themselves as small as possible, praying that the next shell wouldn't have their name on it. Rothman threw himself flat behind a thick oak as a shell burst 30 yards to his left. The concussion wave rolled over him like an invisible wall, pressing him into the cold, wet earth. Dirt and debris rained down, and somewhere nearby someone was screaming. He was up and moving before the echo of the explosion faded, his medical training overriding the instinct to stay down and stay safe. The screaming came from a foxhole on the edge of the perimeter. Sergeant William Parker lay half buried in loose soil, his left leg twisted at an unnatural angle. 2 other soldiers were already pulling him free, their hands working frantically to clear the dirt from his face. Rothman slid into the crater, his trained eyes immediately assessing the damage. Compound fracture of the femur. The jagged end of bone protruded through torn fabric and flesh. Blood pumped steadily from the wound, not arterial spurting, but serious nonetheless. Without immediate treatment, Parker would be dead within the hour, either from blood loss or shock. Working with practiced efficiency, Rothman cut away the sergeant's trouser leg, exposing the full extent of the injury. It was worse than he'd initially thought. The bone had shattered in multiple places, and fragments had torn through muscle and tissue. In a field hospital, this would require surgery, blood transfusions, possibly amputation. Here he had his hands and what remained in his medical bag. "Hold him steady," Rothman commanded the 2 soldiers. "This is going to hurt." What followed was a brutal necessity. Rothman cleaned the wound as best he could with what little water could be spared, picking out fragments of cloth and debris. He had no anesthetic stronger than the harsh words he used to distract Parker from the pain. The sergeant bit down on a leather strap, his screams muffled but no less agonizing to hear. Rothman worked quickly, realigning the bone fragments, packing the wound with the last of his clean bandages, splinting the leg with branches cut to length. By the time he finished, his hands were covered in blood, and Parker had mercifully passed out from the pain. It was the best Rothman could hope for under the circumstances. The sergeant might lose the leg eventually, but if they could get him to proper medical care within the next day or 2, there was a chance he could keep it. As Rothman cleaned his hands with precious water from his canteen, Major Harrison appeared at the edge of the crater. The battalion commander's face was grim, more so than usual. "We need to talk, Captain," Harrison said quietly. They moved away from the wounded, finding a spot behind a cluster of rocks that offered some privacy. Harrison pulled out a crumpled cigarette, his last one, and lit it with shaking hands. He took a long drag before speaking. "I'm ordering a breakout attempt for tonight," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. We punch through their lines to the south, fighting our way back to our own forces. It's a gamble, but staying here means we're dead or captured within 48 hours. Rothman felt his stomach tighten. He'd known this moment was coming, had felt it approaching like a storm on the horizon. "What about the wounded, sir?" Harrison took another drag, the smoke curling up into the gray morning air. "They'll have to stay behind. We'll leave them with what medical supplies we have left and hope the Germans treat them according to the Geneva Convention." "That's 43 men, Major. 43 Americans we'd be abandoning." "I know exactly how many men it is, Captain," Harrison snapped, then caught himself. His voice softened. "I know. Believe me, I know. But I have to think about the 600 who can still walk and fight. If we stay, we all end up captured or worse. At least this way, the majority have a chance." Rothman was silent for a long moment, his mind racing through scenarios and possibilities. What Harrison proposed was militarily sound. The wounded would slow them down, make noise, leave a blood trail that even the most incompetent German patrol could follow. Taking them meant compromising the entire battalion's chance of survival. Leaving them meant abandoning men who had trusted their leaders to bring them home. "There might be another way," Rothman said slowly, an idea forming in his mind even as he spoke. Harrison looked at him sharply. "I'm listening." "We don't abandon them, but we don't take them with the main force either. We establish a casualty collection point here, heavily camouflaged, supplied with whatever we can spare. Leave me and a small medical team to care for them. You take the mobile force and break out. Once you reach our lines, you can send a rescue party back for us." "Wait, that's suicide, Captain. You'd be defenseless, completely at the mercy of the Germans when they overrun this position." "Maybe, but it gives the wounded a chance, and it doesn't compromise your breakout attempt. Besides," Rothman allowed himself a grim smile, "there are rules about medical personnel. The Germans might actually respect them." Harrison was already shaking his head. "I can't order you to do that." "You're not ordering me, sir. I'm volunteering." They argued for several more minutes, but Rothman had made up his mind. He was a doctor before he was a soldier, and the oath he'd taken to do no harm meant more to him than any military regulation. In the end, Harrison relented, agreeing to leave Rothman with 2 medics, 6 riflemen to provide security, and whatever supplies could be spared from the breakout force. The rest of the day passed in frantic preparation. Rothman oversaw the construction of a concealed aid station in a natural depression about 50 yards from the current perimeter. The location was carefully chosen. Dense underbrush provided concealment from casual observation. A small stream offered fresh water, and the terrain allowed for some defensive positions should they need them. Trees were cut and arranged to form a rudimentary shelter covered with branches and camouflage netting salvaged from abandoned positions. Foxholes were dug around the perimeter, positions that could be defended by a handful of men if necessary. The wounded were moved carefully, one by one, each transfer a delicate operation that risked reopening injuries or triggering internal bleeding. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, Rothman gathered his small team. There were 8 of them in total. Privates Anderson and Rodriguez, both trained combat medics with several months of experience. 6 infantrymen who had volunteered to stay behind. Men too injured to make the breakout march, but still capable of handling a rifle if needed. Corporal Mitchell, despite his shattered collarbone. Sergeant Parker, immobilized but conscious now, his pain managed by one of the precious morphine syrettes. Others with various degrees of wounds that prevented them from attempting the hazardous nighttime breakout through enemy lines. "I won't lie to you," Rothman addressed the group quietly. "What we're about to do is dangerous. The Germans will overrun this position eventually, probably within hours after the main force breaks out. Our job is to stay hidden, keep quiet, and care for the wounded until help arrives. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We're medical personnel now, not combatants. The rules of war are supposed to protect us. We'll see if they do." Private Anderson, a 22-year-old from rural Oklahoma, raised his hand tentatively. "What if they don't, sir? What if they don't respect the rules?" It was the question they were all thinking, but hadn't wanted to voice. Rothman met Anderson's eyes steadily. "Then we deal with that situation when it comes. But I believe in the basic humanity of most soldiers, even enemy soldiers. Germans are not monsters, despite what the propaganda says. They're men like us following orders, trying to survive a war they didn't start. Most will honor the conventions regarding medical personnel. Most, but not all." They all knew the stories, the rumors of atrocities committed by both sides. War had a way of bringing out the worst in men as well as the best, but dwelling on such possibilities would paralyze them with fear, and fear was a luxury they couldn't afford. As darkness fell, Major Harrison made his final rounds of the position. He stopped at the aid station, his face barely visible in the gathering gloom. He shook Rothman's hand, the gesture formal and final. "Good luck, Captain. We'll be back for you within 48 hours, I promise." "We'll be waiting, Major. Good luck with the breakout." Harrison nodded once, then disappeared into the shadows. Within minutes, the sounds of movement filtered through the forest as the main body of the battalion prepared to move out. They would wait until full darkness, around 2200 hours, then make their push toward friendly lines. Every able-bodied man was needed for what would essentially be a fighting retreat through enemy territory. Rothman listened to the sounds of departure, the muffled cursing as men gathered their gear, the soft clink of equipment being checked one final time, the whispered commands passing down the line. Then, gradually, the sounds faded until only the natural noises of the forest remained. The wind rustling through the pines, the distant call of an owl, the soft murmur of the stream nearby. They were alone now, 43 wounded men and 8 who had chosen to stay with them, cut off deep in enemy territory with no way to call for help, and only the faintest hope of rescue. Rothman made his rounds one more time, checking on each patient, offering quiet words of encouragement, adjusting bandages and splints by the dim light of a carefully shielded flashlight. Private Sullivan's condition had stabilized, though his fever remained worrisome. Sergeant Parker was resting as comfortably as could be expected, the morphine having dulled the worst of his pain. There were others. Lieutenant Frank Morrison with severe burns from a white phosphorus grenade. Corporal Dennis O'Brien with a sucking chest wound that Rothman had sealed with an improvised valve. Private First Class Robert Chen with a severe concussion that left him drifting in and out of consciousness. Each man represented a story, a life interrupted by the brutal realities of war. Rothman knew their names, knew where they came from, knew about their families waiting back home for letters that might never arrive. This knowledge weighed on him as he worked through the night, monitoring conditions, redistributing the limited supplies he had to maximize their effectiveness. Around midnight, the sounds of battle erupted to the south. The breakout had begun. The distant crack of rifle fire mixed with the deeper boom of grenades and the sustained bursts of machine guns. Flares illuminated the night sky, casting eerie shadows through the trees. Rothman and his team listened in tense silence, trying to gauge the progress of the fight from the sounds alone. The battle raged for over an hour before gradually subsiding. Either the main force had broken through, or they had been pushed back. There was no way to know which, and speculation was pointless. All they could do was wait and hope. Dawn of the 5th day brought an unsettling quiet to the forest. The usual sounds of small arms fire and artillery that had become background noise over the past days had ceased entirely. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Rothman knew what the silence meant. The Germans would be moving through the area now, securing their positions, searching for the Americans who had slipped through their fingers. It was only a matter of time before they discovered the aid station. Everything depended on what happened in those first moments of contact. He gathered his small defensive force, the 6 riflemen who had volunteered to stay, and issued what he knew would be his most important order, what others might call his most useless order, an order that seemed to contradict everything they'd been trained to do as soldiers. When the Germans come, and they will come, nobody fires a shot. I don't care what they do or how they approach. You will not engage unless I give you a direct order to do so, and I'm telling you right now, I won't give that order. We are medical personnel caring for wounded soldiers. That is our identity now, and that is what will keep us alive. Do you understand? The men looked at him with expressions ranging from confusion to outright disbelief. Corporal Jake Williams, one of the volunteers, spoke up. "Sir, with all due respect, they're the enemy. If they come at us, we should defend ourselves. If we defend ourselves, we become combatants," Rothman explained patiently. "And combatants can be treated as legitimate military targets under the rules of war. But medical personnel, clearly identified and engaged in the care of wounded, are protected. The moment we fire on them, we lose that protection, not just for ourselves, but for every wounded man in this position." "And if they don't care about the rules?" another soldier asked. "Then firing on them won't save us anyway. Our only chance, our only real chance, is to trust in the basic decency that exists even in war. I need you to trust me on this. No matter how hard it gets, no matter how scared you are, you do not fire unless I order it. This is not a suggestion. This is a direct order, and I need your word that you'll follow it." One by one, the men gave their reluctant agreement. Rothman could see the doubt in their eyes, the fear that he was asking them to sit defenseless while the enemy closed in. He felt that fear himself, a cold knot in his stomach that no amount of logic or reason could completely dispel. But he also knew, with a certainty born of years of medical training and service, that their only chance of survival lay not in fighting, but in healing. The morning passed slowly, each minute stretching into an eternity. Rothman kept his team busy with tasks, checking and rechecking the wounded, organizing and reorganizing their meager supplies, improving the camouflage around the aid station, anything to keep minds occupied and hands busy, anything to prevent the paralysis of fear from setting in. Around 1000 hours, they heard voices, German voices, coming through the forest from the east. Rothman felt his heart rate spike, adrenaline flooding his system with the ancient fight-or-flight response. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to remain calm, to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Everyone stay calm," he whispered to his team. "Remember what I said. No weapons. We are medical personnel." The voices grew closer, accompanied by the sounds of men moving through underbrush. Rothman could make out individual words now, though his German was limited. They were conducting a systematic search, sweeping through the area to locate any American survivors from the previous night's breakout attempt. Then a shout. They'd been spotted. Rothman stood slowly, deliberately, his hands raised above his head. He had removed his steel helmet earlier, knowing it marked him as a combatant. Now he wore only his medical armband, the white field with its Red Cross symbol, the internationally recognized marker of his profession. German soldiers emerged from the trees, weapons raised, their faces tense and alert for any sign of threat. There were perhaps a dozen of them, led by a sergeant whose uniform marked him as a veteran, someone who had seen his share of combat. The sergeant barked orders, and his men quickly spread out, covering the aid station from multiple angles. Rothman remained standing, hands high, making no sudden movements. Behind him, his team followed suit, those who could stand doing so with arms raised, those too injured to stand remaining still and visible. He could feel the weight of the moment, understanding that everything, all of their lives, depended on the next few seconds. The German sergeant approached cautiously, his weapon trained on Rothman's chest. His eyes took in the medical armband, the wounded men, the hastily constructed aid station with its clear markings as a medical facility. For a long moment, nobody moved. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then the sergeant lowered his weapon fractionally and spoke in heavily accented English. "You are medical officer?" "Yes," Rothman replied, keeping his voice steady. "Captain David Rothman, Medical Corps, United States Army. These are wounded soldiers under my care. We are non-combatants." The sergeant studied him for another long moment, then turned and called out to someone behind him. Another German soldier emerged from the trees, this one wearing the distinctive markings of a medical officer. The two Germans conferred in rapid German, gesturing toward the aid station and its occupants. Rothman waited, knowing that his fate and the fate of every man in the aid station hung in the balance. He had gambled everything on the hope that even in the midst of war, even between enemies, there remained some respect for the ancient traditions of medicine, the understanding that healers stood apart from the killing. The German medical officer approached, and Rothman could see intelligence and experience in his eyes. This was someone who understood the realities of battlefield medicine, who had himself treated wounds and fought to save lives under impossible conditions. The officer circled the aid station slowly, examining the wounded, noting the improvised equipment and the severe shortage of supplies. When he had completed his inspection, the German officer returned to Rothman and spoke in much better English than the sergeant. "I am Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, Medical Service. Your men are in poor condition. How long have you been without supplies?" 3 days, Rothman replied. "We were cut off during the initial encirclement. These are the wounded from my battalion who could not be evacuated?" Weber nodded slowly. "And you stayed with them?" "I'm a doctor. They needed care." Something shifted in Weber's expression, a subtle softening that suggested understanding, perhaps even respect. He turned and issued orders to the German soldiers, who lowered their weapons and began to pull back slightly, establishing a more relaxed perimeter. "Your order to your men," Weber said quietly, so only Rothman could hear. "The order not to fire. That was very wise. Some of my soldiers, they are young, they are nervous. If you had fired on us, even one shot, this situation would have ended very differently." Rothman felt the tension that had been coiled in his chest begin to ease slightly, though he knew they were far from safe. "I told them we were medical personnel, not combatants. I told them to trust in the rules of war." "The rules of war," Weber repeated with a slight smile. "In my experience, Captain, the rules of war are fragile things, easily broken when fear and anger take control. You took a great risk. It was the only choice that gave us all a chance." Weber considered this, then nodded. "Perhaps you are right. Come, let me see what you have for supplies. We will see what can be done for your wounded." What followed over the next several hours was something that would stay with Rothman for the rest of his life. The German medical officer directed his men to bring forward their own medical supplies, supplementing Rothman's exhausted stores with bandages, medications, and equipment. Together, the two doctors worked through the wounded American and German working side by side to address the most urgent cases. Weber examined Sergeant Parker's shattered leg with a practiced eye, nodding approval at Rothman's field work. "You did well with this one. In a proper hospital, he could keep the leg." "Here," he shrugged expressively, "we do what we can." They worked on Private Sullivan next, Weber providing antibiotics that Rothman's supplies had lacked. The German doctor cleaned and redressed the wound with professional efficiency, his hands gentle despite the rough conditions. Lieutenant Morrison's burns received proper treatment for the first time in days. Corporal O'Brien's chest wound was checked and the seal reinforced with better materials. As they worked, Rothman found himself talking with Weber, two physicians sharing the universal language of medicine that transcended national boundaries and military uniforms. Weber had been a surgeon in Berlin before the war, attached to a major hospital with a promising career ahead of him. The war had taken him from operating theaters to battlefield surgery, from saving lives in sterile environments to fighting death in muddy foxholes. "Sometimes I think we doctors are the last sane men in this insane war," Weber said, as they finished treating the last of the wounded. "We alone remember that these are human beings, not just enemy soldiers." "What happens now?" Rothman asked, the question that had been weighing on his mind throughout the treatment session. Weber's expression grew serious. "You and your wounded will be taken to a German field hospital, then eventually to a prisoner of war camp. I will arrange for you to remain with your men as long as possible. Medical personnel are usually kept separate, allowed to continue treating prisoners. And my team, the soldiers who stayed with me, they are combatants according to military law. They will be processed as prisoners of war. But I will note in my report that they were engaged in medical duties when captured. It may help." Weber paused, then added quietly, "Your order to them not to fire, Captain. That order saved their lives. If there had been resistance, even token resistance, the outcome would have been very different. You understand this, yes?" Rothman nodded slowly, understanding the full weight of what the German officer was telling him. The order he had given, the order that his own men had thought useless or even cowardly, had been the difference between life and death. Not just for him, but for every wounded soldier in the aid station. By late afternoon, German transport had been arranged. The wounded were carefully loaded onto trucks, a process that was painful despite everyone's best efforts to minimize discomfort. Rothman supervised each transfer, ensuring that no patient was jostled unnecessarily, that every man was as comfortable as circumstances allowed. As the last truck was being loaded, Weber approached Rothman one final time. "I want you to know, Captain, what you did here was not useless. As I heard one of your men describe your order, it was perhaps the bravest thing I have seen in this war. To stand without weapons, to trust in rules that are so often broken, to believe in the humanity of your enemy, that takes courage of a different kind than the courage of combat." "I just did what any doctor would do," Rothman replied, though he felt the weight of the compliment. "No." Weber shook his head firmly. "Many doctors would have armed themselves, would have prepared to fight. You chose a different path, and because of that choice, 43 men will live to see the end of this war. That is not nothing, Captain. That is everything." They shook hands then, two physicians on opposite sides of a war, united by the common calling to heal rather than harm. As Rothman climbed into the truck with his wounded, he looked back at Weber standing in the forest clearing, a gray figure in the gathering dusk. The journey to the German field hospital took several hours over rough roads that had been churned into mud by military traffic. The trucks bounced and lurched, and despite the driver's best efforts to avoid the worst potholes, every bump sent waves of pain through the wounded. Rothman and his medics did what they could to stabilize patients during the journey, but it was a rough trip that undid some of the progress that had been made earlier. The field hospital was a commandeered school building in a small French village that had changed hands 3 times during the fighting. The Germans had established a functional medical facility in the gymnasium and several classrooms, with operating theaters set up in the most protected areas of the building. Rothman and his wounded were processed quickly, the German medical staff demonstrating professional efficiency that he had to admire even in his role as captive. True to Weber's word, Rothman was allowed to remain with his men rather than being immediately separated as a prisoner. Over the following days, he worked alongside German doctors and nurses, treating American and German wounded side by side. The medical staff treated him with professional courtesy, recognizing in him a fellow physician dedicated to the same cause of preserving life. During this time, Rothman learned the fate of the breakout attempt. Major Harrison and the main body of the battalion had successfully fought their way through German lines, though at terrible cost. Nearly half the force had been lost in the fighting, killed, wounded, or captured during the desperate night march. But the survivors had reached American lines and immediately began organizing a rescue mission. On the morning of the 8th day after the encirclement had begun, the village came under American artillery fire. The field hospital staff, both German and American patients, were quickly moved to the basement as shells began falling on the outskirts of the village. Rothman found himself crouching in a dark cellar next to Hauptmann Weber, listening to the sounds of battle overhead. "Your people are coming," Weber said matter-of-factly. "The front is collapsing here. We will likely be overrun by this evening." "What will you do?" Rothman asked. Weber smiled sadly. "I will do what you did, Captain. I will remain with my wounded and trust that your people will respect the rules regarding medical personnel. Perhaps your example will inspire the same humanity in them." By mid-afternoon, American forces had entered the village. The fighting was brief, the German defenders falling back to new positions rather than making a costly stand in a location they couldn't hold. Rothman emerged from the basement to find American soldiers securing the building, and the relief he felt was so overwhelming it nearly buckled his knees. Among the first wave of troops was Major Harrison, thinner and more haggard than Rothman remembered, but alive. The battalion commander pulled Rothman into a fierce embrace, unconcerned with military protocol or the watching soldiers. "We came back for you," Harrison said hoarsely. "I told you we would. How are the wounded?" "Alive," Rothman replied simply. "All 43 of them. We didn't lose a single man." Harrison pulled back, studying Rothman's face with an expression of wonder. "All of them? Captain, that's impossible. In 8 days, cut off behind enemy lines, you didn't lose anyone?" The Germans treated them according to the conventions. They provided medical care, supplies, transport. We lost no one to combat or neglect. As American medical personnel took over care of the wounded and began arrangements for evacuation, Rothman sought out Hauptmann Weber. He found the German doctor sitting quietly in what had been his office, waiting calmly for whatever fate awaited him as a prisoner. "Your people have arrived," Weber said without preamble. "You are free now." "Thanks to you," Rothman replied. "You could have treated us very differently. You chose not to." Weber shrugged. "I am a doctor. Like you, I took an oath to do no harm. That oath does not end because someone wears a different uniform. What will happen to you? I will be a prisoner like your men would have been if your rescue had not come. Perhaps I will spend time in one of your camps. Perhaps the war will end before that matters. Either way, I will survive. We doctors are useful, even in captivity." Rothman extended his hand. "Thank you, Hauptmann, for everything." Weber took his hand, his grip firm and warm. "Thank you, Captain, for reminding me that even in this war, there are men who still believe in something beyond killing. Your useless order, it was not useless at all." In the weeks that followed, as Rothman returned to regular duty with the battalion and his wounded were evacuated to rear area hospitals, the story of what had happened in the Vosges forest began to spread. At first, it was just talk among the men who had been there, sharing the tale with others in their unit. But gradually it spread further, becoming one of those stories that soldiers tell each other in quiet moments, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, humanity could still prevail. Years later, when Rothman had returned to civilian practice and the war was a memory rather than a present reality, he was contacted by a military historian researching what was now called the Lost Battalion incident. The historian wanted to understand how Rothman had managed to save every one of his wounded in circumstances where most would have expected total loss. "The thing is," the historian said, "according to every tactical manual, you should have allowed your wounded to be captured while you attempted to escape and evade. Or you should have prepared defensive positions and fought to the death. What you did, ordering your men not to fire, trusting in enemy compassion, that's not in any manual. In fact, most would call it reckless, maybe even useless, as a military order. Rothman smiled at that, remembering Weber's words in the German field hospital. It only seems useless if you forget what we were trying to accomplish. We weren't trying to win a battle. We were trying to save lives. Every tactical manual is written for soldiers engaged in combat. But we weren't soldiers in that moment. We were medical personnel caring for wounded. Different mission, different tactics. But how did you know it would work? How did you know the Germans would respect the medical conventions? I didn't know, Rothman admitted. But I believed. I believed that most men, even enemy soldiers, retain their basic humanity unless circumstances strip it away. By refusing to fight, by clearly identifying ourselves as medical rather than combat personnel, we gave the Germans the opportunity to choose humanity over violence. They could have chosen differently. Some units might have. But I had to believe that most men, given the choice, would choose to respect the rules that separate war from mere slaughter. The historian scribbled notes, then looked up. There's something else I'm curious about. Your men, the ones who volunteered to stay with you, they thought your order was useless, maybe even dangerous. How did you convince them to follow it when the Germans arrived? Rothman was quiet for a moment, remembering the fear in those men's eyes, the tension in their trigger fingers as enemy soldiers approached their position. I didn't convince them, not really. I gave them an order and told them to trust me, and they did. That trust, more than anything else, is what saved us. If even one man had panicked and fired, the whole situation would have collapsed into violence. But they held their discipline, and that discipline gave peace a chance to work. The historian finished his notes and closed his notebook. You know, Captain, your story has implications far beyond that one incident. It suggests that even in war, even between enemies, there are alternatives to violence if men are brave enough to try them. I don't know about implications, Rothman replied. I know that 43 men who should have died made it home to their families. I know that German soldiers chose mercy over expedience. I know that an order everyone thought was useless turned out to be the most important order I ever gave. Beyond that, I'll let the historians draw their own conclusions. But in the quiet hours of the night, when sleep was elusive and memory was strong, Rothman often thought about those days in the Vosges forest. He thought about the decision to stay with the wounded when escape was possible, the decision to trust in rules that war had made fragile, the decision to order men to stand defenseless in the face of the enemy. Each of those decisions had seemed questionable at the time, possibly even useless or foolish. Military training emphasized preparation for combat, readiness to fight, the importance of maintaining a defensive posture. What Rothman had done violated nearly every principle of tactical doctrine. Yet it had worked. He remembered Corporal Williams, one of the men who had questioned his orders most vocally, visiting him months after the war ended. Williams had lost part of his foot to frostbite during the ordeal, but had otherwise recovered completely. They sat in Rothman's civilian office, drinking coffee and talking about old times. "I have to tell you something, Doc," Williams said, using the old familiar address rather than the formal rank. "When you gave that order about not firing on the Germans, I thought you were crazy. I thought you were going to get us all taken out. I was so scared, I almost pulled the trigger anyway when they came through those trees." "What stopped you?" Rothman asked. "You did. The way you stood there, so calm, so certain. I figured if you believed it would work, maybe I could believe it too. And you were right. That order saved my life, saved all of our lives. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. What seemed useless at the time was actually the most useful thing anyone could have done." Rothman treasured that conversation, as he treasured the letters he received over the years from the men he had saved. Sergeant Parker, who had kept his leg and returned to farming in Iowa, Private Sullivan, who became a teacher and named his first son David in Rothman's honor, Lieutenant Morrison, who overcame his burns and became a successful businessman, Corporal O'Brien, who survived his chest wound and lived to see his grandchildren born. Each letter was a reminder that his decision, his supposedly useless order, had rippled outward in ways he could never have fully anticipated. 43 men had lived. Those men had gone on to marry, to have children, to build lives in the peace that followed the war. Their children had children, and those children would have children in turn. The arithmetic of survival multiplied across generations until that single decision in a French forest had touched hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives. In 1953, Rothman received an unexpected visitor at his medical practice. The man was in his early 50s, well-dressed, speaking English with a distinct German accent. He introduced himself as Friedrich Weber, and for a moment, Rothman could only stare in surprise. Hauptmann Weber? I thought. I wasn't sure what happened to you after the war. I was a prisoner for 18 months, Weber said, settling into the chair across from Rothman's desk. Then, repatriated to Germany when hostilities ended, I returned to Berlin, to my old hospital. It had been damaged by bombing, but was being rebuilt. I have been working there since, trying to help rebuild my country's medical infrastructure. What brings you to America? A medical conference in New York. I am presenting a paper on battlefield trauma treatment, but the real reason I came was to find you, Captain, to tell you something I did not get to say during the war. What's that? Weber leaned forward, his expression serious. Your order to your men not to fire. At the time I told you it was wise that it saved lives. But I did not tell you that it saved more than just your men's lives. It saved mine as well. Rothman frowned, not understanding. How do you mean? When we found your aid station, my men were tense, expecting combat. We had been in heavy fighting for days. Men in that state, they react before they think. If your soldiers had fired even one shot, my men would have returned fire immediately. Many would have perished on both sides, likely including myself. As I was one of the first to approach your position, your order created a moment of peace in the midst of war, and that moment saved lives on both sides of the conflict. I never thought about it from that perspective, Rothman admitted. Few do. We think of orders in terms of how they affect our own troops. But every military decision has consequences that ripple outward, touching enemy soldiers who are also someone's son, someone's father, someone's brother. Your useless order, as I heard it described, proved to be perhaps the most useful order of that entire campaign, because it chose life over death when death would have been so much easier. The two men talked for hours that day, reminiscing about the war from their different perspectives, marveling at the strange fortune that had brought them together as enemies, and now reunited them as friends. When Weber finally left, promising to stay in touch, Rothman sat alone in his office and wept, not from sadness, but from a profound sense of gratitude that he had made the right choice in that forest so many years ago. The story of the useless order became, over time, a case study in military medical schools and ethics courses. It was examined from multiple angles, tactically as an example of non-conventional thinking in impossible situations, ethically as a demonstration of the continued relevance of international humanitarian law, even in desperate circumstances, psychologically as evidence of the power of human compassion to transcend tribal boundaries. But for Rothman, it remained something simpler and more profound. It was a reminder that in the calculus of war, where success is measured in territory taken and enemies destroyed, there are other metrics that matter more. Lives saved, humanity preserved, mercy chosen over vengeance, compassion selected over expedience. In the final analysis, what made the order seem useless to those who first heard it was precisely what made it effective. It rejected the logic of combat in favor of the logic of healing. It prioritized survival over victory. It treated enemy soldiers as potential allies in the shared goal of minimizing suffering. The order was useless only if you believed that the purpose of soldiers was solely to fight. But Rothman had never believed that. He believed that the purpose of soldiers, like the purpose of all humans, was to preserve life whenever possible, to create conditions for peace, to remember that every person, regardless of uniform, deserved to be treated with basic dignity. When he finally retired from medical practice in 1967, Rothman was interviewed by a local newspaper. The reporter, too young to remember the war firsthand, asked him what he considered his greatest professional accomplishment. "I could talk about surgeries I performed or patients I saved," Rothman replied. "But the truth is, my greatest accomplishment was an order I gave in a French forest in October 1944. An order that everyone thought was useless, but which saved 43 American lives, and, though I didn't know it at the time, several German lives as well. That order taught me something that has guided me through my entire career, both during and after the war." "What did it teach you?" the reporter asked. "It taught me that the most powerful weapon we have is not violence, but compassion. That the bravest act is not to fight, but to refuse to fight when fighting would be easier. That the most useful orders are often the ones that seem most useless at first glance, because they ask us to believe in something better than the worst impulses of war. It taught me that healing is not just about bandages and medicine. It's about creating spaces where humanity can survive, even in the most inhumane circumstances." The article appeared on a Sunday, accompanied by an old photograph of a younger Rothman in his military uniform. By that afternoon, his phone was ringing with calls from veterans who had served with him, men he hadn't spoken to in decades, reaching out to share their own memories of that desperate time in the Vosges. One call came from Private Rodriguez, now a grandfather living in Arizona. "Doc, I just read the article. I wanted you to know that I tell my grandkids about you every Veterans Day. I tell them about the doctor who was braver than any soldier because he chose to heal instead of hurt. They don't always understand, not really, but someday they will." Another call came from Major Harrison himself, now a retired general, living in Virginia. "I've thought about those days a lot over the years, David, about the decision you made to stay with the wounded and the order you gave your men. At the time, I thought you were throwing your life away on a gesture that would accomplish nothing. I was wrong. Your gesture accomplished everything that mattered. It proved that even in war, especially in war, there are choices we can make that affirm life rather than celebrate death." As the sun set that evening, Rothman sat on his porch and thought about the long chain of events that had flowed from a single decision made in darkness and fear so many years ago. He thought about the men who had lived because he chose to trust in rules that war had made fragile. He thought about the German doctor who had honored those rules and the soldiers on both sides who had chosen humanity over violence. The order had been called useless because it required men to stand defenseless, to trust in the mercy of strangers who wore enemy uniforms. In a war where every instinct screamed for action, for combat readiness, for the security of weapons in hand, the order demanded inaction, trust, vulnerability. Yet that supposedly useless order had changed everything. It had created a space where the rules of war could function as intended. It had given good men on both sides the opportunity to choose compassion. It had transformed what should have been a massacre into an affirmation of the better angels of human nature. And in the end, wasn't that what military medicine was always about? Creating spaces for healing in environments designed for harm, preserving life in situations optimized for death, trusting that even the enemy retained enough humanity to respect the ancient compact between healers and those who wage war. Rothman understood now, in a way he hadn't fully understood even while living through the events, that his order had not been useless at all. It had been, in fact, the most useful thing he had ever done, not because it achieved a military objective or contributed to tactical success, but because it preserved the fundamental human values that war threatened to destroy. 43 men had gone home from that forest. 43 families had been spared the telegram that began with, We regret to inform you 43 futures had been saved by an order that seemed in the moment like surrender or foolishness or a naive trust in rules that war routinely violated. But it hadn't been any of those things. It had been a clear-eyed recognition that in certain circumstances the path to survival lay not through strength, but through vulnerability. That the way to save lives was not to prepare for death, but to proclaim dedication to healing. That the most powerful weapon available was not the rifles in their hands, but the Red Cross symbols on their armbands. As darkness fell and stars emerged in the clear night sky, Rothman raised his glass in a silent toast to all the men who'd been in that forest. The Americans who had trusted him enough to follow an order that contradicted everything they'd been trained to do. The Germans who had chosen to honor the rules even when violation would have been easier. Hauptmann Weber, who had understood that the man standing before him with raised hands was a fellow healer rather than an enemy to be destroyed. And most of all, he toasted the power of what others had called a useless order. An order that had proven that even in the depths of war, even between enemies engaged in mortal combat, there remained possibilities for peace, moments where humanity could transcend violence, spaces where healing could triumph over harm. The forest in the Vosges Mountains had long since returned to silence, the scars of battle healed by time and new growth. The men who fought there had grown old or passed on, their stories fading into history. But the lesson remained, sharp and clear and eternally relevant. Sometimes the most useful orders are the ones that seem most useless. Sometimes the bravest action is to refuse to act. Sometimes survival depends not on how well we fight, but on how courageously we choose peace when war seems inevitable. And sometimes, just sometimes, a single decision made by one man in a desperate moment can ripple forward across decades, touching lives that would never know his name but would be forever changed by his choice to believe that even in war, compassion could still matter, rules could still function, and humanity could still prevail. That was the true story of how one medic's useless order saved an entire surrounded battalion, not through tactical brilliance or military innovation, but through the simple, profound act of choosing healing over harm, trust over suspicion, life over death. In the end, it was the most useful order Captain David Rothman ever gave, and its echoes continue to this day, a testament to the enduring power of compassion even in humanity's darkest hours.